Welcome to Table Talk.
Hello, everybody.
We talk around the table about theology, culture, and about ministry in general. We want it to be applicable to life. It comes from Martin Luther, who would discuss all sorts of things around his dinner table with his students, and they were recorded in a book called Table Talk. And so we're coming to you today, and we're trying to think about wisdom. As we've been in the book of Proverbs, wisdom is commended to us. It's commended to be the thing that we pursue, that we make aim for it, and that we look out for it. The Bible is full of comments about our need for wisdom, that if we lack wisdom, that there are ways that we can grow in that. So living skillfully is how I would describe wisdom. It's taking knowledge and applying it practically to everyday life so that you live in accordance with God's ways. There's a gap between what God commands, do not murder, and our hearts, because how we get from being in a place where we don't want to murder to being tempted to murder or being angry at our brother is where wisdom fits right in. That the law can tell us what to do, wisdom tells us how to do it. So Luke, we come to Proverbs. I'm going to be preaching this chapter 1, verses 20 to the end of chapter 1. And wisdom really is personified here with a voice, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. One of the more interesting parts of Proverbs, I think, as I wrote in my e-bulletin, is that wisdom and folly, these things that are concepts, that are attributes in the book of Proverbs, are given living form in some ways. They're personified as two women. This is something we've been talking about as we begin the book of Proverbs, because this is a very important concept. And we see in verse 20 through to the end of chapter 1, we get our first introduction to Lady Wisdom. This is the first but not the last time we hear from her in the book of Proverbs. And we see that she's crying aloud, she's calling out, and she has a message to all those who hear her, both to the foolish and to those who maybe aren't the hard-hearted kinds of fools that mock and scoff, but those who are naive and who need to learn and who need to grow.
Yeah, we get this picture in chapter 1, verse 20 of wisdom crying. It's like a scream, if you would, calling. But there's a desperation to this calling because there are all sorts of people who think that they're on the right path. Yeah. But wisdom is calling out and saying, hey, folks, guess what? There's something wrong. Yeah. What's wrong, and why is wisdom then calling out?
Yeah, Proverbs talks a lot about how there's a way that seems right to us, the way that seems right to men, for those whose hearts are tainted by sin, for those who are affected by the fall. We, in ourselves and in the culture around us, think that there's a way that's right and good, and that leads to the things that we want, the things that we hope for in this life. And as even in last Sunday's sermon we talked about, often these things are actually a trap. This is a theme kind of all throughout Proverbs. The thing that might look good is actually going to kill you. That's in various forms all throughout Scripture, whether we're talking about like lying in wait, as we did earlier in chapter 1, or whether we're talking about sex and sexual relationships, or whether we're talking about things like gossip and slander. There's this idea that there are things that seem right and feel right, and our hearts are driven toward those things, and we seek those things and we desire those things as individuals and as a society of people. And the problem is that none of us have our heads on straight as to what is good and what is right according to God, according to the one who made everything and who is wisdom personified.
Yeah, so we get this idea that since the Garden of Eden, and where Adam and Eve listened to a voice other than the voice of wisdom, that we've been heading down this path of destruction. And so there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of advice. In fact, this chapter will talk about how there's lots of commotion going on. And so Lady Wisdom can't just be nice and sweet and gentle in her call. She actually has to scream above the noise of the voices of folly.
And speak quite strongly as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if she doesn't speak in a way that's direct and clear and crying out above the commotion, um, the people who are simple, who don't know better, even people who are tempted by folly, will find themselves to be in a perilous situation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, Luke, that leads me to what I want to spend the rest of our time talking about then is how do we gain wisdom? How do we discover wisdom in our lives?
In my e-bulletin, one of the things that stood out to me in this passage is this very idea that wisdom is the one calling out. We might think, without coming to this verse, we may think ahead of time that maybe wisdom's a hard thing to find. Maybe it's like a hidden treasure somewhere where no one's going to find it. Few people can find it. It's this exclusive thing. But there's this real sense in which wisdom here is taking the initiative. She's putting herself forward. She is actually making a movement toward people and crying out and making herself heard. I think that's very purposefully there. That's very analogous to the way the Lord reaches out to us through his revelation. I often say, and in biblical discussion conversations and just in my own life, I'm reminded that the Lord was not obligated to reach out to us at all.
Right.
We could have very well been just left to our own devices and not know who he is and not know the way of salvation. So even just starting off with how do we find wisdom, I think it's important to note that God has made it available to us, and not in this even sort of hidden back room kind of way, but in this very obvious way. God speaks both through his general revelation in all of creation, as he is the wise creator. The way the world operates and it very much reflects his wisdom. Yeah. And then he also speaks in special revelation, first through his prophets and those who spoke for him, and then finally and most importantly through his word. And so as we look at the ways God speaks through these different forms of revelation, we have what is essentially wisdom crying out, and it's there for us to see and hear, for all who would want to see and hear it. It's not a hidden esoteric thing.
Yeah, and that's a helpful that's probably a helpful place to start, is that the offer of wisdom is actually calling out to us. And so long before we pursue wisdom, wisdom is pursuing us in that sense, which ought to give us great hope. It ought to give us encouragement that as difficult as life can be in terms of understanding and how to piece things together, God has given us great instruction. He's given us, Proverbs will also speak about the many ways that wisdom is available. So you've talked about, we can see God and how he has embedded his wisdom into creation, how he's given us his word so that we would know it. There's other sources. Proverbs will talk about listening to advice and accepting instruction so that you'd be wise. Why is it important to have many counselors in your life?
Yeah, it's very important for us as those who so naturally drift away from wisdom to have many people in our lives who have gone before us, who have lived life, who know better than we do. So much of Proverbs is from the older to the younger, and that's so much a biblical pattern. There's many opportunities in life for us to make mistakes and for us to stumble and fall, and it's a grace that the Lord not only gives us in the church today, but has always given his people, that there are those who can speak into another person's life, and those who have the life experiences that someone else may not have had. Especially in Proverbs, we have this category of someone who is young, who doesn't know and who hasn't had life experience, and it's very good and very natural and very helpful that there would be those who are further along who can speak into that as well. There are various giftings as well, and this is something that all throughout the New Testament is played out in terms of just life in the church and the way that God's people minister to each other with the gifts that they're given. And it's each person has a different gift and is able to minister in a different way. And so through his people, through a multitude of people with different giftings and different life experiences, we can have a much fuller understanding of how God would have us live and what God has done for us and how we understand that all in His Word.
There's something interesting about this process of aging. And I'll share a little story here, Luke. Actually, you and I and one other person, we were on our way to a conference in the U.S., and I was sitting in the back seat. I think you were driving, and I just decided in that moment, hey, I've got these two guys. Let's talk about my sermon.
Yeah.
I was just using it as an opportunity to talk through what I was preparing for the next day since I'd been away, and you guys were there. And I had this dawning realization that I was quite a bit older than the other two guys that were in the car.
Yeah.
And suddenly there was this realization for me that it's not that I'm such a great fount of wisdom or that I thought I was something special or spectacular, but there was this dawning realization that, well, I've grown out this little beard and it's got more gray than it's got any other color in it. And Proverbs does speak about how as there are gray hairs, that there's a sign there of wisdom and age. Sometimes it's hard to accept that as we age, we value in our culture youthfulness. Youthfulness is associated with energy and vibrancy and life and activity. But Proverbs speaks about the blessings of those who are older. In fact, next week you'll be looking at the blessings of those who are older by looking at beginning of chapter 2.
Yeah.
So not only is it important to have older people who are pursuing us, and I want to encourage, if you're older, why not just get to know someone who's young? You don't have to be spouting off wisdom to them. You can just be involved in their life, and the actual just day-to-day interactions, a text message here, an interaction there, you'll do more for them by just being involved in their life, being interested in them, being loving to them. But there's another aspect in Proverbs 2:1. There really is this sense of parents actually functioning as well as a source of wisdom.
Yeah, there's no question in the Old or the New Testament that the family is crucial to God's design for the world, God's design for His people and the church. Family is so important. God speaks of Himself as our Father. We are His children, and He's set up the world from the very beginning to be centered around family, of a mother and a father and children, parents speaking wisdom and discipline and instruction into the lives of their children to raise them up. Very much, we want to have a multitude of counselors in various ways throughout life, but first and foremost, God's design is that wisdom would come through parenting, through the discipline and instruction of a parent to a child. That is so crucial and so important and so clearly a part of God's foundational design for all of creation. It's very easy to see, not only in Scripture, but just in the world. We see the beauty and the goodness that comes out of good, strong, healthy families, and we see all of the brokenness and terrible things that come from bad families. And when this design doesn't happen the way it was intended, there's almost really the foundational unit for all of society in God's design is family. And Proverbs is very clear about that. Really, the first 9 chapters is all a father speaking to a son.
Yeah. And so one thing that's helpful maybe for those who've come from homes where they struggle to respect their father and mother, maybe their parents didn't discipline them well, maybe their home was broken, maybe there were lots of problems. One thing to say is that God gives us the church, and in the church, He gives us spiritual fathers and spiritual mothers. And that's part of the blessing of being a part of the family of God, that as much as we come from imperfect homes, even the best of homes is imperfect, God has given us, by His grace, one another, so that in friendship, in those who are older, and in the church, that we might learn how to live skillfully and wisely. Let's talk for a minute just practically about some resources. I don't know if there's resources that you'd like to recommend for people with regard to growing in wisdom.
Yeah, I'll have you start. I have a few things bouncing around in my head, but I need a minute.
Well, so one of the
Get 'em
places, yeah, one of the places I'd start is there's lots of great parenting resources and materials.
Mhm.
If you want to grow in wisdom, one of the practical ways is to grow as a parent, and you never stop being a parent once you have a child. As long as they're alive, you're going to be a father or a mother. And so I need my dad and my mom more now than
Mhm.
I probably ever realized before. So I'd recommend a few resources. Ted Tripp has a book called Shepherding a Child's Heart, and that's a great resource that talks about different stages of life in terms of how you can shepherd children and nurture their souls. There's other resources in terms of how do you help your kids on a Sunday morning parenting in the pew. I don't remember. I think it's Robbie Castleman or Robbie. Yeah, I think Robbie Castleman is the author. She has written a great little book, just talking about how you can shepherd your kids on a Sunday morning. I'd also recommend that you read some books on friendship. Friendship can be a surprising place where you discover the beauty of what it means to know the wisdom of God. For women, Christine Hoover has an amazing book called Messy Beautiful Friendship, and I've gleaned a lot from it. I'll mention one other resource. It might not seem like a typical one on wisdom and how to grow in wisdom, but Dietrich Bonhoeffer's little book, Life Together, he really talks about what it looks like to be, what spiritual friendship essentially is. While it's from a confessional Lutheran perspective in the midst of coming out of in the context of World War II and trying to forge a confessing church, there was some beautiful things there about how they were trying to pull together people who would be like-minded and spur one another on in an age of incredible foolishness and folly. So that would be one book. We've read it as a book club in the summer, and if you haven't read it, you need to read Life Together by Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Yeah, I would add another book on parenting by another Tripp. We've got one by Ted Tripp, and there's also one written by Paul Tripp, which is simply entitled Parenting. Paul Tripp is a wonderful, accessible, very helpful writer, and that's a book that I can highly recommend on the parenting side. And that is
I'll just add here, those two, Ted and Paul, are brothers,
very...
and so that might not be a bad thing to consider when you've got two guys writing on parenting and they've both been ministers and are in ministry.
Absolutely. And then as we think more about wisdom literature in general, maybe this wouldn't be maybe so much for the younger kids, but an online resource that I found very helpful in understanding the scriptures is the Bible Project. The Bible Project is wonderful, and they do a wonderful job particularly of breaking down different genres of the Bible, and particularly ones in the Old Testament. They're very, very good at that. They've got wonderful videos and a great app. And so if you're wanting to maybe dive a little bit more into understanding Proverbs as wisdom literature, they'd be able to provide some wonderful resources on that.
And as always, the first place to start is where James says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives liberally or generously. If you're not sure how to grow in wisdom, if you're not sure what to do, the very starting place is to start with the Lord, that he never despises us when we come to him. There is no stupid question in the Christian life. That the only folly is to think that we've got the answer without pursuing the wisdom and knowledge of God. So I'd encourage you, take some time, just ask the Lord, help me to grow in wisdom. As you trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, you're acknowledging him in all of your ways. And as Proverbs 3:6 says, he'll make your path straight. That's the path to the good life. It's what we're aiming for. It's why we're here to encourage you. As always, hope to see you on Sunday. 10 a.m. is when we have our services. You're always welcome. And we're thankful for you joining us on Table Talk. If you ever got a question, just drop us an email, either Luke or myself, and we'll be glad to serve you however we can. Until next week, thanks for joining us on Table Talk.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.